Hi, I'm Chris Fitzgerald, and thanks for joining me for the second installment of Theory and Practice. At this point in history, jazz education is common, and resources to learn more about jazz theory and practice are plentiful and easily accessible. But have you ever wondered how great jazz musicians learned how to play before such resources existed? We've probably all heard apocryphal stories of jazz greats wearing out the grooves of vinyl records they were trying to emulate or practicing 10 to 16 hours a day as they learned their craft. And this explains a lot about how they became great. But what was going on in their minds, in their brains, as they absorbed and taught themselves the language of jazz? How did the sounds they were imitating and the harmonic language they were absorbing organize themselves in their brains? No one knows the answer to these questions, but brain research suggests that when presented with the unknown, the human brain automatically tries to find order in it. This happens both consciously and subconsciously, and it can be difficult to untangle the two paths even to the person who experiences the search for order. Further from the source, music theorists attempt after the fact to try to describe what is going on in music that has already happened. But in spite of the first axiom of music theory, which is that music theory is descriptive, not prescriptive, many descriptions of past music end up getting understood as prescriptions for making music in the future. And arguably, approaching a flow experience like melodic creation and improvisation from a primarily theoretical and analytical perspective can often be counterproductive and make the whole endeavor seem more intellectual and complicated than it might otherwise be. In today's presentation, entitled Organic Harmony and Changing Tones, I will attempt to lay out, after over 40 years of playing improvised music, the way I understand my brain to have subconsciously mapped out the issues of jazz harmony and improvising melodies over harmonic progressions. The results of this process sometimes conflicted with the jazz theory training I encountered in the educational world, and although these conflicts usually amounted to small differences in note choices, getting to the bottom of them always seemed important. To me, music theory was not a recipe to follow in order to create music, although it arguably can be that, but rather a way to consciously understand and express the way my brain subconsciously and intuitively processed and understood the music I already loved. I offer these results here not as the truth or an attempt to discredit other ways of approaching the subject at hand, but rather as an alternative way of looking at the same issues for anyone who might find it useful. And with that said, let's begin. First off, what does the term organic harmony actually mean? There are many different definitions of the word organic, but the one that led me to use the term for this approach to harmony comes from the Oxford Dictionary, and it goes like this: organic, adjective, denoting a relation between elements of something such that they fit together harmoniously as necessary parts of a whole, the organic unity of the integral work of art. Once we've made all the requisite jokes about cage-free, grain-fed, free-range harmony with no antibiotics ever, the above definition, when applied to harmony, could be simplified as contextual harmony. In other words, as always looking at each chord and the notes between the chord tones in context of the other chords around it, rather than as a chord in isolation. This is important because the same chord name often functions differently depending on its context. A simple example of this would be the difference between an F major 7 chord in the context of a progression in F major versus the same chord in a C major progression. The chord tones for both chords, when taken literally, will be exactly the same. The notes between the chord tones, however, exist within the greater key center, so the most organic implied fourth degree above the root of that F major 7 chord would be a B flat in the key of F major, but a B natural in the key of C major. Let's hop over to the piano and give an example of that in both sight and sound. Right, so here's an F major 7, root, major 3rd, major 7th. In the key of F, in a progression in the key of F, you want to hear the B flat when this chord is happening as one of the notes between the chord tones, as in this example. However, if you're in the key of C major, that same F major 7 chord, which will now be the second chord, wants to have a B natural as one of the organic notes in between the chord tones, as in this example. Another simple example might be the difference between an A minor 7 chord in a progression in G major versus the same chord appearing in a progression in C major. In G major, the organic implied 6th degree above the root of the A minor 7 chord would be an F sharp, but in C major, the implied organic 6 would be an F natural. Let's go over to the piano and take a look and listen to that one. So here we have an A minor 7 chord, root, 3rd, and 7th. In the key of G major, and here it is stacked up just as a regular chord, in the key of G major, it wants to have these notes in between it. So it wants to have an F sharp between the 5th and 7th of the chord. Here it is sort of spread out. Root, 7th, and 3rd. So here we'll hear it in the key of G major with an F sharp as one of the notes in between the chord tones as an organic choice. So basically, okay, but in the key of C major, that same A minor 7 chord, it'll be the second chord this time. It wants to have an F natural as the 6th degree above it because of the key that we're in, as in this example. So if we play the scale, same chord, two different tendencies for notes in between the chord tones because of context. Well, these are just two simple examples, but they represent two instances where my intuitive understanding of the question, what are the notes between the chord tones, clashed with my early jazz education that told me C a major 7 chord, build a major scale from the same root, or C a minor 7 chord, build a Dorian minor scale from the same root. In both cases, my ear naturally wanted to hear the chords in context, and I initially became confused when what I was taught didn't match what I was hearing. In addition to this, the notion of switching scale roots, literally every measure in the harmonies, seemed counterintuitive to the information I was getting in the melody. Let's compare two opposing ways of viewing several very common jazz progressions. Let's begin by taking a look at the first 8 bars of the well-known standard All of Me. Our first issue with analyzing harmony is deciding which version of the chord changes to use and how literally to take the chord symbols of the version we do decide to use. This is important since jazz harmony is not standardized, and since the sources of lead sheets developed independently of each other, looking at different versions produces different versions of the chord changes, as in the example shown here. As you can see, in this case, the differences are mostly superficial, so we'll go with the simplest version at the top. Notice that no alterations of the two dominant chords are given. This is important because if we take these two unaltered dominant chord symbols at face value as Mixolydian scales, as one school of jazz theory would suggest, we would end up with chord scales that look something like this. And just as a note, in the interest of time and continuity, I'll play the next 3 examples on the bass, but at the end of this section, we'll go back to the piano and compare all 3 examples side by side. So in the example here on the screen, the four different chord scales, which are just plug and play, will be Ionian, Mixolydian, Mixolydian, and Dorian, and they will sound like this. Now, I know plenty of accomplished improvisers who play from this paradigm today, so this approach is not wrong. I'm not saying that. But when I was first learning this song and plugging in chord scales to match the chord symbols, my intuition balked at some of the notes between the chord tones that this approach suggested. Specifically, my ear didn't naturally accept the F sharp in C sharp in the E7 scale or the F sharp in the A7 scale. In addition, my ear wanted to hear the B flat as part of the A7 chord, since it is outlined in the melody. To my ear, while the note choices we're looking at here on the screen are clearly not wrong, they're also not organic to the song. Over time, based on intuition and listening to a lot of players who tended to play a more organic version of the harmony, I realized that what I was hearing was a version of the harmony where the only notes that changed from chord to chord and measure to measure were those notes that had to change in order for the chord symbol to exist as notated. This is really important. You only change what you have to from one measure to the next without making assumptions about the notes between the chord tones. In the case of this progression, the only notes that have to change from the note collection of C major are the G sharp, which is the third of the E7 chord, and the C sharp, which is the third of the A7 chord. Since the B flat is in the melody and would function as the flat 9 of the A7 chord, I included it as part of the A7 note collection as well. Looking at the harmony in this way produces the following note choices for the same passage. And just as a side note, the two notes in parentheses over the E7 and A7 chords, they're included because while there are very few rules in jazz, one that most ears agree on is that when a flat 9 is present, a sharp 9 is implied and vice versa. In this case, the sharp 9 of each chord is shown in parentheses because it serves as a passing tone when the sound of the augmented second between the flat 9 and the third is not desired. So this example would sound like this. This way of looking at things felt like a huge improvement to my ears, as though these note choices were somehow more fundamental and natural than the previous set. The notes that my intuition had labeled as artificial are no longer present, the note collections are faithful to the melody, and there are several fewer notes not in the key than in the first version. Ironically, while it's a common perception that altered dominant chords are more complicated and dissonant than their unaltered counterparts, in this case, the note collections produced by the altered dominant chords are more inside the key of C major than the unaltered ones. Equally ironic, they're also more inside the key center than the superimposed altered dominant scales that chord scale theory would suggest replace these. So in other words, if we plugged in E7 diminished whole tone and A7 diminished whole tone, they would be further away from C major than the scales that we ended up with. This is why I've come to think of this approach under the umbrella of the term organic. Well, when listening to great players who seem to effortlessly outline the harmony of any song they play in their improvisations, I notice that they've developed the craft of landing on exactly the right note at exactly the right time that would let the listener hear the harmony going by. In this case, the notes that define the changing harmony can be described as changing tones. These are notes in any measure that must be different from the previous harmony due to the structure of the chord. Landing on these notes, either on or near the beginning of the measure where the chord changes, lets the listener hear the harmonic changes, even if there's no harmonic instrument outlining the chords themselves. And at this point, I came to understand that changing tones were the main driver of melodic lines that outline the harmony. but they were often obscured by the way chord scales were presented, with each chord having a scale built from the root of the chord. Because the changing tones were not often the roots of these scales, thinking about each scale as a separate entity obscured the voice leading of the changing tones I was aiming for and made hearing the larger key center more difficult and unnecessarily complicated. What my brain seemed to be searching for was a basic map of the changing tones within the overall key. After many years and failed attempts to represent the subconscious organization my brain seemed to be in search of, I came to express the idea of a changing tone map, as in the example below. And I'll go ahead and play that and then I'll talk about it a little bit. So a changing tone map, right? This is basically the organic version of the notes that fit with all of me, changing only what the chord requires be changed. But in this example, they're all going to be expressed from the note C rather than from root jumping, where each chord symbol has a different root. So this is all in the key of C. So that would sound like this. In this way of looking at the available notes to play, notes that are different from notes in the previous harmony, in other words, changing tones, are marked above with a plus sign. The changing tones that are outside of the key center have the strongest harmonic weight, and therefore they're the strongest choices to use to help outline the harmony through the melody. Looking at the harmony in this way also makes it easier to see just how many of the available note choices already exist within the key signature of the song. To my brain, this made this approach more organic and less confusing. In the entire passage representing 8 bars of the tune, looking at the progression as 4 different chord scales would yield 28 different scale tones to think about. But thinking of it as C major, but with changing tones, enabled my brain to think of one major key with 3 chromatic notes that occur in specific places, like toggle switches. The notes either switch up or they switch down. This seemed a lot more logical and, more importantly, much simpler. Before moving on, let's move over to the piano and look at all 3 ways of looking at this excerpt side by side. Okay, so here we are back at the piano. We're going to compare these 3 ways of looking at these chords, chord scales, note collections, whatever we want to call them, side by side. Here's the traditional chord scale approach with Mixolydian scales for the dominant chords. And here's the organic note collection approach with the different roots. And finally, here's the organic note collection approach from the root of the key, with every note of the collection starting from C. So we want to remember that the whole point of doing this organic note collection thing, especially from the same root, is so that we can more easily see what the changing tones are and what the voice leading is like. So they were never really intended in this approach to be seen as quote-unquote scales, just rather collections of notes that we can improvise from. Well, one of the ways that melodies and melodic improvisations often come together is that they are built as embellishments of guide tone lines. And in the case of this progression, we're going to work with a simple guide tone line that's very similar to the melody of Take the A Train. It sounds like this. And we're going to embellish and do an elaboration of that guide tone line. So in the first example, we're going to embellish it or elaborate it so that it, instead of just being these notes, we're going to make each 2-measure phrase use this intervallic pattern. And from there, we're just going to follow the chord changes that we have written. Now, the way that this pattern works out, the first and last chord change, the C major 7 and the D minor 7 at the end, they will be identical either way we approach this progression. So in this example, I'm going to play the first two measures with the complete elaboration and the last two measures with the complete elaboration. But as you hear the middle four measures, I just want you to imagine what that elaboration would sound like, and I'm just going to play the guide tone lines. Okay, here we go. Right? So those two middle measures would be variable depending on which approach to the harmony that we use. So now let's do an example where we show how that would flesh itself out with the Mixolydian chord scale approach. It would sound like this. Again, we want to listen to the notes elaborating the line because the guide tone line is exactly the same. Next, here's what that same elaboration would sound like with the organic note collection approach. Now, each person will have to decide for themselves which version of the notes between the chord tones they like best. But for me, I know this is the one that my ear was always looking for when I was playing standards, is these sort of organic notes between the chord tones. Okay, next, let's take this a little bit further, and we're going to further elaborate this guide tone line so that it takes up the entire octave of available notes. And that elaboration will be basically this interval pattern mapped onto each chord change. And of course, we're going to follow the guide tones, right? If we take that pattern and map it onto the Mixolydian chord scale approach, we'll get a sound like this. Right? And last, we're going to take this same pattern, the same elaboration, and follow the intervals of the organic note collection approach, and it'll sound quite a bit different. It sounds like this. Okay, so as always, each person has to make up their own mind about which version of the notes between the chord tones they like, but as you know by now in this presentation, the organic approach is the one that my ears were always trying to find. So last, if I'm thinking of each tune as a bunch of different chord scales with a bunch of different roots, it really just confuses my brain and it makes it hard for me to see the changing tones. But if I'm thinking of the entire progression, as in the song All of Me, as just C major, with these toggle switches that go up and down based on what chord is happening at any point, then it's really easy because I don't have to think of a lot of new information. It's C major with notes that flip up and down, as in this, and it makes it easier to play like motivic, melodic content that is not root bound, as in more like what a melody would be, as in this following example. obviously those last two chords at the cadence were very inorganic, they're substitutions, but everything before that was just basically C major plus these toggle switches. And that's the way that it is easiest for my brain to think of these large progressions, not as separate scales, but one big key with some changing tones. Before we move on from this progression, All of Me, I want to talk a little bit about the way in which these outlining solos in jazz can take place within this organic concept. So part of the thing that we've been talking about this entire presentation is that a changing tone is really important, because when you land on a changing tone, you're showing that the harmony has changed at that point. And you're landing on the one note, which really tells the listener what chord you're sort of moving to at that point. But what about all those places where there aren't any notes that change from one note collection to the next? So if you have two chords that have the same note collection, how do you outline the changes then? Well, what you do then is you land on chord tones on the downbeats. What's interesting about the changing tone concept is that you come to understand where the changing tones are, but then you also come to understand where the changing tones are not. And by that, what I mean is, if you play most standards that are largely key-centric, at least the A sections will be largely key-centric. If you play most standards and you figure out where the changing tones are, what you'll find out is if you were to write out all the chord tones for every chord in the song, or every chord in that key-centric part of the song, what you would discover is that most of the chord tones are already built into the key in the first place. So yes, you want to land on the changing tones so that your solo can be understood as outlining the changes, but you also want to land on chord tones, and those chord tones, when you don't have to think about all these different scales happening, those chord tones, 80 to 90% of them already exist within the key. So I'd like to finish this section by playing a transcription of the solo that you heard in the introduction to this episode. I'm going to call it an unaccompanied bass solo. Out of context, it's bass with a Drum Genius drum track. And I've transcribed that solo, and I want to play the audio and put the transcription on the screen so you can hear and see where the changing tones are, and also see that most of the resolutions, almost everything that's not a changing tone in this solo, is just a diatonic chord tone. That's part of the key of the song anyway. At the very end of this, I just want to add that when I recorded this solo, I didn't have to think about anything special. I didn't have to think, oh man, land on all the changing tones and play an organic approach, because you're doing a video about organic harmony and changing tones. I just took a solo on All of Me and then transcribed it. So I didn't have to think about anything special. This solo was not anything like, oh, it's particular to this presentation. It's just I just thought of play an outlining solo over All of Me with a drum track, and then later you can transcribe it and use it as an example. So I'm going to play the audio for that, and we're going to put the transcription up on the screen. The transcription is not only the notes, but it's also analyzing which downbeats are changing tones and which downbeats are diatonic chord tones, and there's a few other resolutions in there, but it's almost all changing tones and diatonic chord tones. Okay. we've covered the basics in some detail, we're going to speed up and cover a couple of complete tunes at this point. We're going to go over an entire blues in F and then the entirety of Stella by Starlight. And for that, we'll probably spend most of our time here at the piano just in the interest of time. So let's get moving. Okay, so let's start with a well-known blues that most jazz musicians know. This is Tenor Madness by Sonny Rollins. And to make it easier to compare with the other tune we're going to do later in this presentation, I've transposed it into the key of F. So the melody of the tune goes like this. Okay, so if we take the traditional chord scale approach to this progression, to improvising on this progression, we would end up with the following paradigm. F mixolydian, then B flat mixolydian, then F mixolydian, then the 2/5, C Dorian F mixolydian, then B flat mixolydian, again, and then F mixolydian, then D diminished whole tone, then G Dorian, C mixolydian, and then the previous 4 bars repeated faster. So if we do a count here, if we're counting basically linearly from the beginning to the end, we have to interrupt our thought process pretty much completely because of the changing roots of this approach. So we've got 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12, 13, 14 different chords to think about. In other words, we have to think about the root of the chord. If we're thinking this way, we have to think about the root of the chord changing 14 times. So it looks like 14 different scales. The only one I left out was the repeat of the B flat 7 chord scale in the second line because we just had it. Okay, next, here's the organic harmony version of the same progression notated in the key signature of F7. All the notes are spelled from the same root and with changing tones notated above where they occur. So beneath the staff, the name of the scale, including the changing tones, is expressed as different modes of an F scale. So in other words, we're just going to play from F to F for every chord in this, and we're only going to change what has to be changed based on the chord that we're seeing. In this case, we would get F mixolydian, F Dorian, F mixolydian, still F mixolydian, then F Dorian, again, F mixolydian, F mixolydian with an added F sharp, F Ionian, still F Ionian, and now we have this condensed version of the previous 4 bars. So in this way of looking at it, we can actually see how many of the notes stay the same from measure to measure and how many change. So if you look at it, as opposed to thinking of 14 different chord scales, what we're actually seeing here is just a couple of changing tones. And notice from any one chord to the next in this entire progression, the most number of notes that changes from measure to measure is 2. So let's talk about what that means. When you have a 7th chord, you basically got 4 chord tones that you know what they are, right? These are the 4 chord tones. And then between those chord tones, there are 3 non-chord tones. And this is true because there's 7 notes in any tonal center. All right, so 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. So we know what the 4 chord tones are. The question is, what are those 3 notes in between? And hopefully these fingers show up on the camera correctly. Doing my best. So when we look at the progression in this way, what we see is from first measure to the next, only one note changes. From measure 2 to measure 3, only one note changes. From measure 3 to measure 4, nothing changes. From 4 to 5, one note changes. 5 to 6, nothing changes. 6 to 7, one note changes. 7 to 8, one note changes. 8 to 9, two notes change. 9 to 10, technically no notes change. And then the turnaround is just a condensed version of the previous 4 bars. So if we take that as our way of approaching this song, we can now go to the simpler way of thinking, which is to think about it's really mostly the same. Most of the notes stay consistent throughout this progression, and now we can just focus on accenting those changing tones. So what we have here, this is the same progression distilled down to only the changing tones and a few common chord tone resolutions. And note how this example really mirrors the underlying structure of the melody. So these are the notes, the most important notes to land on that are changing tones, and it enables me to think just completely in F, which is basically what the melody does anyway. We can learn so much from melodies. So what I want to do is just basically kind of do what we did a little bit on All of Me, and I want to basically play a riff, a 1-measure riff or a 2-measure riff, and take it through the whole tune, changing only the changing tones. And that riff or interval pattern will be like this. So basically 1, 2, 3, 4, 1, 2, 3, 4. That's it. So every measure will have 2 quarter notes and a half note. Okay? And if we take that through this progression, it sounds like this. This is sort of how many riff blues actually get written, but it's also the way that a lot of people think about improvising over these progressions. Because if you really focus on these changing tones, and as you see on the screen, there's a couple of, like in measure 4, there's no change from the note collection in measure 3 to measure 4 that's needed, but we put a common 4/3 resolution of the dominant chord. And then again in measure 9, if we'll remember this G minor C7, if you remember in the melody, it goes. So you basically have this descending chromatic line, and it's outlining those changing tones. So if you do that, all of a sudden, it becomes very easy to solo with these changing tones as a basic guide tone line. And it's all built off this. That basic sort of guide tone line underneath. Okay, so now moving on. The last example represents the simplest way to express what's going on in a blues that I know of, and it's basically what I'm hearing every time I'm playing over a blues progression. To my mind, it's basically F7, but with toggle switches, where the toggle switches are what we're calling changing tones. And looking from the harmony from a key-centric perspective is also really useful for voice leading chord tones from each harmony to chord tones in the next measure. When you express all of these chord tones from the same root or keep them in the same range, the paths leading from one to another are more easily seen, as in this example on the screen. And I've done an analysis, and that over the course of this blues, and this is very nerdy, and I apologize for that, but it's what we're about. It's a theory video. Over the course of this blues, 92% of the chord tones listed, which is 55 of the 60 chord tones already built into a blues by the chord symbols themselves, they're already diatonic to the key, which means that 5 of them are not, right? So most of what we're playing is already in the key of F. So if we're talking about guide tone lines, we can take the bottom line that we see here on the screen and basically just connect those guide tones, and we'll do this quickly so we don't waste too much time. This is probably the least interesting guide tone line of the 4. Now we're going to go to the next guide tone up, so the second guide tone from the bottom, and this is the one that's going to give us a lot of the changing tones that we were using in the previous examples, and which in fact Sonny Rollins used for the melody of Tenor Madness, and that'll sound like this. So starting from the A natural, the second guide tone up. Okay, that one's very interesting, and it's got a lot of the changing tones built into it. Let's move on to the third guide tone line. Third one up from the bottom. Again, so the one on the very bottom was built mostly on the root, and it was a little less interesting for that reason. This is built on a lot of fifths and roots, and probably is not the most melodic of it. You notice that this guide tone line has 0 changing tones in it, which is one of the reasons why it's not very interesting or not very outlining sounding. And last, we'll go to the very top line, starting on the E flat, and we'll play those guide tones from there. And this one's got a little bit more interesting material in it, although not a ton of changing tones. Sorry. Okay, so this one's got some motion to it, and it makes perfect sense. It's probably the second strongest of the guide tone lines. Now, thinking of the progression in this way, of lining up the chord tones all in the same exact range, is just a visual aid. What we need to remember is you don't have to connect one line always to the other line. It does help to connect chord tones to chord tones and to land on changing tones when you can. Okay. So here's the really interesting thing about this. We've already seen how the guide tone line that is basically the changing tones is pretty much what Sonny Rollins did on the melody of Tenor Madness. But for everything else, this next part shows the one big change from this method of looking at harmony from the standard chord scale method. And that is, since we're changing only what we need to change from one measure to the next, and keeping everything else as much the same as possible, we have this sort of 2 roads to Rome thing happening. Everything is the same except for what chord scale ends up on the D7 sharp 9 harmony. So looking here, if we consider the chord symbol out of context and paste the scale in, we get this sound. Whereas if we consider the chord symbol as part of an overall F7 tonality and alter only what is needed to make the D7 chord actually work, we end up with this sound. And what's interesting about that is, well, there's two things. One, it's way more diatonic, but it also contains the third and the flat 9, right? But it also contains those two notes, which are not in the other scale. They're replaced by this A flat. So the diminished whole tone sound. And this one, if we played it from D, would sound. So there's really only one or two notes difference in the entire progression if you think of it as an organic progression versus thinking of it as a chord scale progression. But the benefit to thinking of it as an organic progression is you're really only thinking of it as one key with some notes that toggle up and down rather than 14 chord scales to juggle every chorus. So hopefully that makes some sense, right? Organic is just being able to think big picture in one key. And the other chord scale approach means you have to do a lot of mental juggling to keep up with the changes. Back here at the piano, we're very, very deep into this video, and we still have the longest and most challenging example to put forward, which is the entire tune of Stella by Starlight. Well, hopefully at this point, we kind of understand what the process is. We examine the changes, we look at the regular chord scale approach, we look at the organic approach, we look at the changing tones, we look at the chord tones. Well, with a tune as long as Stella, we'd be here for 3 hours if we went through the whole tune in that detail. So what we're going to do here, I'm going to encourage you, please download the PDF so that you can see things at full size and have all the information that you need. But what we're going to do is we're going to put the full page up on the screen above the piano keyboard. It's going to be really small, but then we're going to only examine the first 8 bars of what's on each page so that we can put that up on the screen and actually go into some detail. You can sort of figure out how we would look at the rest from the PDF. Okay, so beginning with the changes comparison for Stella. If you look at this changes comparison, especially if you look at the whole thing, you'll notice that many things are the same, but lots of things can be marginally different or sometimes even very different, especially if you're looking at the original changes from the original 1944 score of The Uninvited. But for the jazz changes that most people play, we'll just simplify and we'll go with the first line at the very top for what we're going to look at. So for the first 8 bars, we've got E half diminished, A7 flat 9, C minor 7, F7, F minor 7, B flat 7, E flat major 7, and A flat 7. So moving on to the next page, typical changes expressed as chord scales. If we're looking at the whole sheet, which I hope you're doing on the PDF, or by going full screen on it on your computer, you can see that we're looking at 21 distinct chord scales here built from 10 different roots, which is a lot of information to process. Let's move on to just the first 8 bars. And looking at just the first 8 bars, we've basically got to think, you know, E half diminished, A7 flat 9, which is diminished whole tone, C minor 7, F7, F minor 7, B flat 7, E flat major 7, A flat 7 sharp 4. And even there, just in the first 8 bars, we have 8 different scales: Locrian, diminished whole tone, Dorian, Mixolydian, Ionian, and Lydian dominant. That's a lot of information to process. When I was a beginning player and I was trying to approach playing the changes in this way, it kind of felt like this. And I'm going to give you a real quick visual and example of the kind of insanity that was going on in my head when I was first learning to play Stella by Starlight. At a medium up tempo, it basically, to me, it basically felt like this. 1, 2, 1, 2, 1, 2, 3, 4. Which is just crazy, right? Nobody can really think that fast, process that much information that fast. So that was my first clue that this method of working on things maybe worked for other people. It seemed to work for other people, but it was really not going to work for me. What really occurred to me was the difference between what that felt like and what it felt like to deal with just the melody. So in this next example, we're going to look at just the melody notes, stripped of all the chord symbols in the key signature of B flat, right? So we've got a key signature of B flat, and the melody note, when you look at it like the melody, like this, it's notes without the rhythms. When you look at it like this, you're looking at this music, and even if you didn't know what it was, you're like, yeah, that's a melody in B flat. It's got a couple of chromatic leading tones to the fifth, one from below, one from above, but it's just a big chunk of melody in B flat. So just to give you an idea of what that way of thinking of the song seemed like to me, it was like if I put the pedal down and just play a B flat pedal beneath this whole thing and I let the pedal ring, as I play this melody, it would sound like this. And I'll play it out of time to sort of save time. So those are two very, very different things. The one is the sort of frantic, hyperactive chaining together of chord scales from different roots, and the other one is this melodic statement in which we really just have a diatonic melody in the key of B flat with two chromatic tones, both of which lead to the fifth. So the question, of course, is how do we split the difference between these two? Because the former method was not working for me, and the latter method, if I played only in the key of B flat, would lead to what my friend and mentor John Goldsby, always called the diatonic wash of sameness. So how do we get enough information from the chord scales, but also stay in the mindset of, hey, this is just a melody in B flat? How do we split the difference between those two things? So if you're looking at a chunk of melody, either an entire tune as in Stella by Starlight, or the A section of an AABA tune, which many standards, the A sections are all in one key, and you're looking at a melody and you think that that melody says to you, hey, this melody or this chunk of melody is probably all in this key. How can I be sure? Well, what you would do then, if you have the skills to do so, is you would do a harmonic analysis of the chord changes that go with that melody. In a harmonic analysis, it's just like in classical music. You're basically adding Roman numerals to show the function of each chord inside the key. If we do a harmonic analysis of Stella, as you see on the screen, here's the whole page. Every chord but one can be analyzed in the key of B flat. Refer to the PDF for that because it's all there in the PDF. The only chord that can't be analyzed in the key of B flat is the F major 7 in chord C12 in measure 13. But however, we're going to focus on just the first 8 bars of this, just to show how all of these, like we suspect from the melody that it's all in B flat, but these first 8 bars will show us that in fact the chords, even the chords themselves, are also either in the key of B flat or adjacent to the key of B flat. So to go through it really quickly, the first 8 bars, we have a 2-5 of 3. So that E half diminished A7 sharp 9 would want to resolve to D minor, which would be the 3 chord in B flat. Instead, it goes to a regular 2-5, C minor, F7, and that's just 2-5 and B flat, and then you have 2-5-0-4, F minor 7, B flat 7, which actually resolves to 4, which goes to a flat 7-7, which is actually a mode mixture chord, which just means that chord comes from B flat minor rather than from B flat major. So these chords in the brackets, these 2-5s of 2-5-0-3, 2-5-0-4, these are what's called secondary function chords. And so you, with secondary function chords, you do have to change notes from the key, but usually only a couple of notes, and it means that they are meant to resolve to a chord in the key. We'll get to this information, how to do a harmonic analysis, in the next theory and practice video. But for now, if you can't do that yet, don't worry about it. Usually if the melody is telling you, if you're looking at a melody that has almost no accidentals in it, chances are good that it's harmonized with something where you can use the organic approach to that song or to that segment or excerpt of that song. Okay, so moving on, where we will go next is the alternative organic changing tone approach. And if you've been through the video this far, you know this is where we're going. This is where we look at everything in terms of just the whole song is expressed from B flat to B flat. We're looking at every chord in the song as though it comes from or is adjacent to the key of B flat. And whenever we have to change a note either from the key of B flat or from the previous measure, we're going to put a plus sign above it showing this is a changing tone. So for the entire song, we see it still looks pretty complicated when you do this, but when you go to just the first 8 bars and look only for those pluses and notes with accidentals, now all of a sudden you're seeing, okay, this is looking a little simpler. So if you'll remember what the chord scale approach sounded like, here's what it sounds like with the organic changing tone approach, just expressing everything from B flat. You get basically, I'm going to call out all these scales as though they're B flat scales. You get a Lydian scale, a Lydian with an added sharp 2, an Ionian scale, again, Mixolydian scale, again. Now it's a Mixolydian with a flat 6. So all of a sudden when we look at it this way, you can see that it's a lot easier to comprehend because everything is a B flat scale, and these notes that change just make it sort of a different sort of B flat scale. Consider the difference between the previous version and this version. There we had to think of E Locrian, A diminished whole tones, C Dorian, F Mixolydian, F Dorian, B flat Mixolydian, E flat Ionian, A flat Lydian dominant. Now we just have to think Lydian, Lydian with a sharp 2, Ionian, etc. So the scales we're dealing with are not abstract or complex. They're basically 1 or 2 notes away from what a major scale would have been anyway. So that this way of looking at it really is, I don't know, to my mind anyway, it's a lot simpler. Simpler still, and this is the part where the rubber really meets the road, because if we're really thinking of B flat, we can just assume that the notes of B flat are there by the fact of the key signature. So the next step is to do a changing tone map or a changing tone reduction. And so here's the whole page of the changing tone reduction. You see all these pluses and notes with accidentals, and those are just showing what's either different from the key signature or different from the measure before. But what we'll really see now on this page are the things that are different from what came right before. And in the first 8 bars, there's not that many differences from one measure to the next. And in other words, in the note collection from one measure to the next measure, we only see 1 or 2 notes that change from measure to measure, which is a far cry from having to think of an entirely different 7-note scale from a different root. Some of those are altered dominant and Lydian dominant chord scales. These are all very simple, just toggle switches that are going up and down from B flat. And so, yeah, this is much simpler. We've got this. And all of a sudden, we're sort of now, instead of thinking of scale, 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 we're thinking about, hey, what's an interesting guide tone line for this 8 bars? How can I connect these changing tones? Because we know we want to land on changing tones to help outline. How can I connect these changing tones from one measure to the next to create an interesting line? So now, in this next bit, we go from the overall just changing tone reduction to now a changing tone reduction where we're going to sort of follow a particular path from chord tone to from changing tone to changing tone to changing tone to chord tones, etc. And in this one, we're going to go from the E to the C sharp to the C. Now there's no changing tone between, sorry, to the E flat. There's no changing tone between the C minor 7 and the F7. So instead of that, we're going to shoot for the third of the F7 chord. Now there's a changing tone from F7 to F minor, which is the A flat, right? So we're going to land on that. There's no changing tone between F minor 7 and B flat, so we're going to default to the third. Again, no changing tone going to the E flat, so we'll default to the third. And then we go to the G flat on the A flat 7 chord. So what we're basically doing is creating a guide tone line to embellish. Our beginning line goes like this. And if we wanted to embellish that guide tone line, we might do something like. And now all of a sudden, what we have is starting to sound more and more like a melody. And we could do this all day long. We could do this over the whole song, but this video is very long. So we'll move on to the chord tones only from a B flat major perspective page. Now looking at this whole page, it doesn't really look that complicated, because what we see is that while there's a lot of notes on the page, 4 notes per measure, obviously, what we see is that there's a few accidentals, and changing tones are not marked here, but there's a few accidentals, but everything is expressed from the same range so that we can voice lead. And the interesting thing about this, because I'm a theory nerd and because I've been teaching theory for about 30 years now, if you really do the analysis and do the math, if you look at this entire page, there are 128 chord tones on this page, but 83% of them, which is 106 of the 128 chord tones on this page, they're already diatonic. That means they're already in the key of B flat, meaning they're already covered by the key signature. We just have to find them, usually with our ears, which is something that we will learn to do. Moving to only the first 8 bars, we can now see we have, a really simple path as we did in the blues. If we wanted to connect one chord tone like the bottom line to the bottom line in the next measure, or the second chord tone up in the first measure to the second one in the second measure, etc., we could do that. Or we can mix and match, which is what we just did in our organic changing tone reduction example. What we did there was we voice led this E to the C sharp, to the E flat on the C minor 7, to the E on the F7, to the A flat on the F minor 7, to the D on the B flat 7, to the G on the E flat major 7, to the G flat on the A flat 7 sharp 4. And sometimes it's useful to use a page like this to see sort of what some of the possibilities are. Eventually, when you're improvising and you're playing outlining solos, you'll get to the point where you're sort of doing this subconsciously and internally and intuitively, where you can sort of hear where the chord tones and the changing tones are, and you're just sort of connecting them one to the other on the fly. But this is a way to sort of look at it on paper. Okay, now having said all of this, with the length that this video has gotten to, the way we'll close out this video is with a transcribed solo over Stella by Starlight, which uses all of these principles. Now, the interesting thing about this transcribed solo is that it was recorded back in, I think, 2015 for one of my thumb position videos. And at the time I recorded it, I wasn't thinking about anything about, oh, I'm going to use this for a changing tone presentation in the future. It was just a video on thumb position, and I thought, well, let's record a solo in thumb position as an introduction to this video. And I just happened to choose the tune Stella by Starlight to do this solo. So I recorded this solo back in 2015. The changes are slightly different than what we've been dealing with so far because I recorded the piano part first, and I made a little, I don't know, quasi-arrangement of Stella, but it's still Stella. What you'll see when you look at this solo is that just about every downbeat or close to the downbeat of every measure, I'm going to end up landing on either a diatonic chord tone on the downbeat or near the downbeat, or a changing tone. And the interesting thing about that is in 2015, I wasn't thinking about any of this. It wasn't like, oh, I have to play in this certain way. I played in that way just because I was thinking it would be good to do an outlining solo. My only thought was, hey, outline the changes with your solo. And this is how it came out. So as you watch the solo unfold, look at the annotations on the transcription. It's going to say either DCT for diatonic chord tone, or there's going to be a plus symbol, which is a changing tone. And this is what eventually my intuition did and still does with a tune like Stella by Starlight. I'm not thinking a million thoughts per chorus. I'm just following these moving planets of these chord tones and changing tones and trying to find interesting and melodic ways to connect them together. So here then is that solo. Hopefully, at this point, the process of looking at harmonic progressions in a key-centric way is relatively clear. At the end of the PDF book chapter that accompanies this video, I'll include some step-by-step instructions for how to go about creating a changing tone map of any progression, and this process, in fleshing out the individual steps involved, will be the subject of a future video in the series. But before the process is expanded to a method that can be used to approach any tune in its entirety, one very logical question to ask might be, when should I use this approach and how far should I take it? There's no definitive answer to that question, and each person will need to decide for themselves whether this approach is useful, and if so, when they should use it. But one question I've been asked many times by students studying this concept over the years is, do you really create maps like this for the hundreds of tunes you have learned? The answer is yes and no. Subconsciously, my brain is always trying to see the unifying and organic aspects of any melody and harmonic progression I'm playing. So when this happens naturally, there's no need to resort to graphic notations of a music theory concept. In other words, if the music is flowing freely, then if it ain't broke, don't fix it. Other times, however, I find myself struggling to make sense of certain parts of a progression. For example, let's say there's a 32-bar song and I'm playing freely over most of it, but there are two 4-bar phrases where my intuitive level of understanding seems to be lacking. During these passages, the result will be that the level of musical flow dips and becomes choked, and the overall performance will suffer because of it. It is in these passages where I will focus on better understanding what's going on, and this often involves formally mapping out the changes of these passages to bring the level of improvisational freedom more in line with the rest of the progression. And to me, this is at the heart of the question about the usefulness of any aspect of music theory. In the end, the goal is similar to how we learn any language. We learn the structure and the rules by some combination of osmosis and formal education. But ultimately, the point is not to be able to recite the rules, but rather to be a fluent and hopefully eloquent speaker. We hope not to have to think about grammar and syntax while we're speaking, since doing so would interrupt the flow. Occasionally, we encounter a situation where we don't know how to pronounce a word or how to formulate a particular thought into a sentence. In cases like this, we might consult a dictionary or other grammatical reference to clear up the lack of understanding. But once that's done, we tend to close the book and carry on speaking or writing until the next roadblock comes along. This is how I would advocate approaching any music theory concept. Use it only until it's internalized, then put the book away until it can help to answer a question. From then on, speak when you can, and refine when the need arises. Wash, rinse, repeat.